What is your take on the war in Ukraine?
So Ukraine is sort of a bifurcated deep state project. So at one level, it's a globalist project. George Soros has been obsessed with it now, probably his number one project above anything else.
I didn't even
Has been
know
this.
that. Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, it goes all the way back. I mean, George Soros was massively investing in Ukraine, even when it was part of the Soviet Union in the early '90s, late '80s.
Oh, wow.
Developed NGOs that he placed there. Really, it was kind of his dream project. Because for his globalist vision and the globalist vision that's shared with people like Klaus Schwab and the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and the Bill Gateses of the world and all of them. And the fundamental premise was they needed to provoke Russia to invade Ukraine at some point, and had been trying to get that reaction for 15 years, ever since they realized Putin was a populist nationalist who was not on board with either wokesterism or globalism.
Right.
Once that became clear, and that Russia would no longer be the happy colony it had been when we were ravaging and raping it for about a decade after 1990. I mean, we had almost destroyed Russia by 1999, 2000. And instead of doing that, Putin wanted to rebuild it. Putin's fundamental premise was a 1997 graduate thesis he wrote when he was between jobs in the University of St. Petersburg, where he argued that Russia could rebuild itself because real power was not the globalist financial power at the top, controlling the banking system and the financial system and the lending system, but rather was real power of what people always had to have: food, fuel, particularly up next, military power, nuclear weapons for self-protection, self-preservation.
Yeah.
And this was a grand test of that. And the globalists needed to keep poking the Russian bear, using Ukraine to do so, keep poking it, hoping it would invade. That would be their justification for waging economic war on Russia, with the belief that that would crush Russia. They would go back in to recolonize Russia, divvy it up, remove Putin, get back to where it was in the 90s, and it would be an example to the world. We, the globalists, control the financial purse strings. That means we govern the world, regardless of military power, regardless of food, regardless of fuel, regardless of natural resources, regardless of And if Putin couldn't resist, you can't resist. If you're in India or Brazil or Mexico or Indonesia, wherever you may be, you can't resist. So primarily, this Ukraine war is a proxy war between Russia and the globalists, between nationalism and globalism, between the idea that resource-driven power matters more and hard military power matters more than soft financial, diplomatic, and political power and
Wow.
cultural power does. The second level was it was an old deep state agenda going back to the end of World War II, which was after World War II, we went into bed with a lot of Nazis throughout Europe because we were looking for who has built-in infrastructure of intelligence networks, supply networks, sabotage networks, smuggling networks that's deeply anti-communist. Well, the Nazis. That's who. So that's why we helped a whole bunch of them escape. We wanted their information for torture, for human experimentation, for rocket building, for biological weapon development, for nuclear missiles. Everything. There was a lot of engineering and scientific skill that we wanted, and that's Operation Paperclip, and that only covers a part of the people we brought over. Klaus
Mm.
Barbie was helping to develop the Colombia, what became the Colombian drug trade, was originally the Bolivian drug trade, which you can read about or listen to Michael Levine on the Eric Hunley Unstructured podcast about, the greatest DEA agent in history who left because he discovered the scale to which the deep state was involved in drug running. And who is it? All goes back to Nazis and Klaus Barbie, of course.
Wow.
So in Ukraine itself is all it means is borderlands. It's all the country means. It had no national identity as the borderlands until the early 1900s. Before then, it was basically divvied up between Western Ukraine, which would usually been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. Before that, they considered themselves what was called Ruthenians, the first Ukrainian nationalist organization in the United States, even in the early 1900s, called themselves the Ruthenian National Organization. This is because they tie themselves to the Kievan Rus, who also Russia ties themselves to. The Rus were actually Swedish and Nordic, came down, but they organized the Eastern Slavs together such that they took on the name of the Rus, hence the Russians. But a variation of it was the Ruthenians. When the Kievan Rus collapsed, what became Russia moved to the north, and what became Ruthenia was just southwest. Yes, southwest of Kiev. And they tied their history to that. And this was the heart of Ukrainian nationalism. But they were mostly part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire or Poland through most of their history. Then you had central and southern Ukraine, which was heavily dominated by one of my favorite all-time groups, the Cossacks. the Cossacks wrote that great letter. There's a big painting and story about the letter they wrote to the Sultan, which they just insult him and all these they insult them in like a Ricada chat kind of way. It's like every crude and crass little image is fantastic. So the Cossacks dominated that part, and they're a very independent group, and so they're at different parts at different places. Then you have sort of the hard eastern part of Ukraine, which was historically part of Russia, going back to the 1700s. And over time, the Russian Empire would take over more and more of Ukraine, but never far west Ukraine. Far west Ukraine would ultimately be split up between the Austro-Hungarian and Polish empires and Polish governments, and Ukrainian nationalism would emerge in that region. And it would emerge as a fascistic ideology. They borrowed heavily from Mussolini in Italy. And that's why they easily made bed with the Nazis when the Nazis rise to power. They briefly had power in the between 1917 and 1921 before it went because the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses. But ultimately, the Poles come in and take over. Stepan Bandera, who's now got statues to him all the way across Ukraine, has museums dedicated to him all across Ukraine. He's in prison in the 1920s for assassinating a Polish leader. He ultimately aligns himself with the Nazis because for multiple reasons, but honestly, it's because their fascistic ideology easily blend with it. They engaged in mass murder against the Poles and the Jews when they obtain power when the Germans come in. But the Nazis, of course, have no interest in elevating Slavs over time. They're very anti-Slavic in their prejudices, and they repress the Ukrainian nationalists and reduce their role in power. Bandera ultimately is released. He's given kind of power by the Nazis, and ultimately partially released. He's put in prison for a while, then released for a while, and ultimately ends up in Germany after the war. The CIA goes in and builds a connection with Bandera's groups in far western Ukraine. We help promote this sort of myth of Ukrainian nationalism in the sense that there was no nationwide unity for Ukrainian identity. Cossacks had one idea, Russians had another idea. Central and eastern Ukraine and northern Ukraine was heavily village based. So it's like this great, like if you read some of the old letters, you read these Bolshevik letters complaining about how originally the peasants were with him and now the peasants are against him. And he explains, it's amazing that they had to have this explained to them, but the peasants explain, the first time you Bolsheviks came to us, you said, get your gun and take back your land from the landlord. Now you're coming to us and saying, give you our gun and give you our land. Yeah, we're not for the latter. So no, thank you. The very locally based, and this even has Cossack ties in large parts of central and eastern Ukraine. Of course, in the 1930s, when the Soviets have control of central and eastern Ukraine, is when the Soviet famine happens. It's not a Ukrainian-specific famine, contrary to the mythology that we would actually help develop in the 1980s at Harvard as an anti-communist project. The Soviet famine may have been targeted at kulaks and Cossacks, which were disproportionately present in eastern Ukraine, but they were also present in Kazakhstan and the Caucasus throughout. And the famine was just across the board. It was not a Ukrainian-specific ethnic genocide. That's a mythology that would get built. We would help develop. First time that pops up is in the 1950s. A lot of Nazi. To give you an idea, the Ukrainian nationalist organizations in the United States and in the West and Canada, some of their publications were banned because they were so overtly pro-Nazi in the 1930s. Wow. That's because this Ukrainian ultranationalism was really only this one region of Ukraine, this far west region, which had its own religious, political, and social history. And just by historical coincidence, ends up aligned with these fascistic elements. But because of that, that would stay a dominant trend in the post-war era to where it was the Nazis who originated the claim that the Soviet famine wasn't the Soviet famine, but was a Ukrainian ethnic-based genocide in order to generate support amongst the Ukrainian nationalists for the German invasion, which they were successful in doing, but that was only in far west Ukraine. People like Bandera were unknown in eastern Ukraine until much longer after the war. But these groups recreate this in the 1950s, but it's still mostly ignored within the historical academy. In the 1980s, Ukrainian nationalists align with deep state, kind of CIA type. There's a lot of people don't realize how much book publishing is backed and financed by what I call deep state operators. You call them the national security state and intelligence operatives, call them what you will. But there are several publishing companies in Britain that were just government funded operations. That's all they were. They were CIA fronts. This is hinted at in Jean Le Carré's novel and film, The Russia House, which is quite excellent. But in the late 1980s is when we bring back the Nazi mythology of Ukrainian nationalism, which is that your real enemy are the Russians, your real enemy is the Soviets, your real enemy is them. They're the ones who deliberately targeted you because you were nationalists and committed mass genocide against you. And so they take a story that never was Ukrainian specific and make it only Ukrainian specific. That starts to seep in a little bit in the 90s. In 2003, 2004 is the first color revolution in Ukraine. The pro-Russian candidate wins. We lie and say that the election was stolen, create a huge orange color revolution in Ukraine. They take to the streets, the same Antifa type street theater we're seeing today. They've just imported the color revolution ideas we exported from groups in the United States, CIA, a lot of deep front organized groups. Some didn't know it, like the Einstein Institute, still don't know that they were being used as a front, but they use a lot of their techniques to create a color revolution and get an Russian candidate elected president, and he popularizes and institutionalizes this alternative Ukrainian nationalist mythology in the form of children's books, educational books, TV shows, museums, statutes. That's where all of a sudden Stepan Bandera becomes a national figure. It's like, how did this happen? How did this guy with clearly Nazi-aligned ideas suddenly become universally popular in a whole generation of Ukrainians? To such a degree that by 2014, it's really built in. Now, of course, they're grifters, so they completely fail that president. He's utterly hated by the time he leaves office in 2010. The pro-Russian candidate who really won in 2004 is finally declared the winner in 2010. He tries to play the Russians against the EU to cut a better deal with the EU. Russia gives him a better deal, and so the moment he says he's going to do the economic deal with Russia, the reason being that Ukraine had no trade tariffs with Russia. And so consequently, they could the concern with Russia is they would close the border economically if they went into the EU, because they didn't want the EU to basically bombard their border, use Ukraine to flood Russia with EU goods without tariffs.
Right.
So that's why they cut a deal. That leads to the Maidan coup. We had been building up the neo-Nazis all the way back to the end of World War II. So they're mostly a lot of their narrative is shaped by books that we help publish, promote, and push. A lot of their ideas are ideas that were, baked out of a CIA lab room. Ukrainians don't recognize this. Like, here's an example of the mythology. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, by 1991, Ukraine is part of the Commonwealth of Independent States with Russia. There's a bunch of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. None of them are owned by Ukraine. None of them are controlled by Ukrainians. All of them are in the exclusive possession of Russia. In 1994, Ukraine decides the Commonwealth of Independent States is going to collapse and they're going to leave the Commonwealth of Independent States. That meant Russia was taking all those nuclear weapons with them. There was no dispute about that. But before the West would recognize Ukraine outside of the Commonwealth of Independent States, required that they sign an agreement that they would the nuclear non-proliferation agreement. That is called the Budapest Accord. That later gets misconstrued in later Ukrainian history to be Ukraine had great nuclear weapons and they gave them up in exchange for security because they were always scared of Russia. That's pure mythology. It's all false, complete lies, just made up. Anybody who lived through it, as I did, knew, like, where did this come from? It came from this is part of the propaganda story that gets told. Mm-hmm. And what happens is for basically 2 decades, they drill into Ukrainians' head, your enemy is Russia, your enemy is Russia, your enemy is Russia, your enemy is Russia. So that in 2014, when they stage a Maidan coup, they have false flags. They blame the government for things that the neo-Nazis were doing. They unleash the neo-Nazi militias that we in the West had been training for about better part of a decade. Same reason the Southern Democrats use the Klan is the same reason that we use neo-Nazi militias in Ukraine. It's people get confused because sometimes they had prominent financiers who are also Jewish and Israeli citizens. What they don't understand is that that's just the practical reality of who they could use. Who do they trust? They don't trust Ukraine. They didn't trust Ukrainian military members to implement a deep state Western agenda. 4 out of 5 Ukrainians fought on the side of the Red Army in the World War II. There were memorials to those soldiers and troops all across Ukraine. They only trusted, who could they trust? They could trust the ultra-nationalist, neo-Nazi aligned groups who would be the most anti-Russian. And what people still don't understand is in Russia, to be a Nazi is to be anti-Russian, much more than it is to be anti-Jewish. Why? Because 4 times as many Russians died in the conflict than died in the Holocaust. That's why. So that's how they filter it. And we promoted them. They basically, as soon as the coup happens in 2014, They stage false flag events. The president has to flee Kiev. And there's rebellions, political outburst and protest all across what you could call the Russian side of Ukraine. This was the part of Ukraine that was added in 1922 by the Soviet Union, by Lenin, which goes all the way from Odessa to Kharkiv, right along the southeastern border, along the Seas of Azov and the Black Sea. And this is also, though, as you note, the resource-rich region of Ukraine. It's where the industry is. It's where the wheat fields are. It's where the agriculture is. It's where the oil and natural gas undeveloped depots are, or regions or reservoirs are. It's the part of the region that borders either the Sea of Azov or the Black Sea. So it has geopolitical significance. But from Odessa to Kharkiv, there's protest. In Odessa, they use the same tactics that the people in Kiev did, which was take over government buildings. What do the people in Odessa do? The militias that take over, they unleash these militias all because a bunch of national security, national territory defense, or what they're called in Ukraine, refuse to quash the protest because many of them are on the side of the protest in places like Donbass, Kharkiv, Kherson, and Odessa. So they send in the neo-Nazi militias instead. What they do in Ukraine, they lock them in the building that they're in, light them on fire.
Yeah, I heard about that.
They sing songs cheering of it later. In the Donbass, they start shooting people in the streets. Same as in Kharkiv, same as in Kherson, same as throughout the Russian-influenced regions of Ukraine. Because going back to the 1926 census, these areas have had substantial Russian population. Odessa used to be a heavy Jewish city until World War II. And then the Nazis just killed almost everybody they could. Lviv in western Ukraine used to be a Polish majority city until they killed them all with the help of Ukrainian nationalists in World War II. So these Russian-oriented regions rebel, massive suppression, and the hardest core pro-Russian region is the Donbass. This is a region that voted like 94, 95, 96% for the Russian-oriented presidential candidate in election after election in 2004, 2010, onward. They decide they're going to declare their independence because they have no interest in this sort of rump regime. And a civil war starts out. Ukrainian military goes in after the militias. But mostly they unleashed the militias. And there's a way to think of it is imagine there had been, after the Civil War, a bunch of black political rebellions in the South. Who would they imagine if they sent in the Klan as their cleanup unit? That's what Ukraine did, because Ukraine didn't trust the local police force. They didn't trust the local military because a lot of them were aligned with the local population. So instead, they sent in the neo-Nazis. They sent in the sociopaths. I mean, there was groups called the Tornado Group who committed brutal assaults on young, very, very young, like 6-year-olds, that kind of thing, and videotaped it and showed it to their parents. It was
Horrible.
Some of the most barbaric. I mean, to give you an idea, some of the Ukrainian Nazi units, the SS Galicia, was considered so horrifying in their conduct that even the Nazis were embarrassed by them. That gives you an idea. They tried to hold them back. They're like, that's a little insane even for us. That gives an idea for what we unleashed. Wow. And basically, it was an insult to Russia and Russians for 8 years running. They signed an agreement with the Minsk Accords. They claim they're going to restore independent power to these regions, give meaningful independent political status, not recognize them as full republics, but give them a lot more political power to self-govern. They never honor it in 8 years and continue to commit just random tragedies. You know, they would shell bomb a school bus stop, things like this. Why? Because they wanted to provoke Russia. Ukraine is a tool for the West, for the deep state, for the globalists to provoke Russia because they needed Russia to invade as their political pretext to engage in globalist economic war against them. What they did not expect was that they would be losing that globalist economic war. Yeah. That it turns out having dollars on a screen is not as powerful as having oil under the ground or having food in the fields or having fertilizer out and about. That when you control, you are largely self-sufficient, fourth largest fisheries in the world as well in Russia. You don't need anything from the West. And if the West cuts off their BMWs and Gucci bags, so what? Ordinary Russian doesn't care. And that's really what the war is about. It's a proxy war between the globalists in Russia, a proxy war between the deep state that wants to prove its utility and line the pockets of the defense industry in the United States. Hence, we're sending them weapons we know they can't use. We're sending them weapons we know they're going to get blown up. Why? Because that justifies another check. And Ukraine has been we treated it like a colony. not only as a proxy war place, but that's why we set up so many biolabs there, because we were going to experiment on them. We saw them as lesser people. We treated them the way the Nazis treated them. We treated them in part the way some parts of the Soviet Union treated them. Though the Soviet Union wasn't as bad because so many of the Soviets were Ukrainian. Whereas the Germans were a little worse, and frankly, the Americans in the West have been a little worse. That's why we didn't care that they were we made them the poorest country in Europe. All their politicians are oligarchic grifters who depend on Western aid or Western connections to the government in order to make money. This goes all the way back to the president of Ukraine after the 1990s onward, who just, by the way, just happened to pass away today. He helped put the grifter oligarchic kleptocratic machine into Ukraine. Wow. This is the reason why when you look at individual donors, the number one country that was the producer of individual donors to the Clinton Foundation was Ukraine. It's like, why is the poorest country in Europe the number one donors to the Clinton Foundation? This is why. This is why Zelensky doesn't care. Zelensky's a coked up actor who played a pretend president. Imagine if Alec Baldwin was made president of the United States of America tomorrow. That's what having Zelensky as president of Ukraine is. He doesn't care what happens to Ukraine or Ukrainians. He has a golden Batista-style parachute that's going to land him in Miami and L.A. doing movie co-produced deals with Sean Penn and Angelina Jolie. And he can do all the coke he wants, and he's got hundreds of millions stashed offshore already as part of this quid pro quo, as revealed in the Panama Papers just a year or two ago. Wow. And Americans are just systematically lied to about what this war is about and what's going on.
That was a breakdown. Thank you, Robert. I just learned a lot about that whole conflict, and I'm not even surprised. I wish I was surprised.
Yeah, I know,
but I'm not. You know, it all makes sense.